All right, so let's talk very quickly about giving our animal a little bit of action. So we don't always want to draw animals that are laying down or just kind of standing around. Sometimes we want some action. So we're going to start out much the same way with our basic structure. We're just going to think about that structure a little bit differently. So here's my rib cage. This is going to be just a running horse, spine, pelvis. All right, so just like when I did the wolf laying down and the tiger laying down, things here are pretty standard. What we're going to start looking at is the angles of these leg bones. And also we have a little bit of foreshortening here. We're going to talk about that more next, but for now, let's just try to pay attention to the positioning of the legs as we see them, because we kind of have both of the front legs out in front instead of, one being very clearly in front of the other. So we're just going to draw both of those in since there isn't really one behind the other one. So here's those joints. They're very pronounced in the front legs. We're just going to get the angles going, okay? And now we can look a little bit at the head. All right, so now we've got enough structure here. Let's go ahead and kind of rough in the form around the structure. But you can see we've got a lot of action here, and that mostly is coming from the angles of the legs. So start just really paying attention to those angles and how they are in proportion with these basic shapes. So the rib cage, the spine, the pelvis, these are almost never going to change. What's going to change is, the neck, the position of the head, and the angles of the legs. And so if you can kind of start to pay attention to that, it's going to make it much easier to draw animals in different positions, doing different kind of actions. And any corrections that you need to make, just make those along the way. Don't worry about getting everything perfect at your first try. And remember, this all kind of has to match up together. We don't want to have, this line here and then this line like way up here. It just wouldn't make any sense. So this needs to be a very solid form all in here as well. And again, I can't really see the hooves, but I can kind of guess what's going on here. So there's going to be a joint here, so this is going to be a little bit rounded. Same here, a little joint right there, and then this hoof is off the ground a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and try to, before we even get to anything else, let's go ahead and try to just put in this back leg here. So we can see, again, the action here starting up from the pelvis, kind of coming down like this. And then this leg is going to be a little bit behind. All right, so let's get back up here and kind of build up the muscle and the neck. And we have a little bit of a different angle going on in the head. So the eye is actually kind of right around here. And actually, so what I see here is there's not enough continuity between this muscle here and then this area right here. So I know that I need to correct that, because it was way up here before. So it was kind of like, you know, we always need to think about this as all being very connected, just like I did with the alligator. Just kind of connected it all. So sometimes you might want to do that before you draw in the legs, because the legs get in the way and they can kind of confuse things a little bit. But again, everything is correctable. So whatever way you choose to do it, just remember that, you know, all mistakes can be fixed. And that's how we learn. All right, so this is our very basic horse. Let's just go ahead and I'll show you just, you know, the mane is something that you don't need to go in and draw every little hair. Just try to get the general overall shape, and that is going to be good enough. I'll put it in the nostril up here. Kind of helps things to make a little more sense, and we can actually see a little bit of the mouth. And then remember, the tailbone comes out a little ways. I can't really see the tail too well, so we're just gonna kind of wing it. And then we'll just kind of look and see if maybe I need to correct the angles of the spine a little bit. Give a little bit more of a curvature here. All right, so again, giving your animal a little bit of action, making it, you know, moving, is really going to be a matter of paying attention to the angles of the legs, where the head is, what the neck is doing. You can see on our original horse, this horse is a little bit more relaxed, and so the neck is down. It's a little bit more parallel with the ground or with the spine, but this horse that's running has its head up a little bit higher, so that's something that you want to pay attention to. So now let's talk about foreshortening, and this is something we need to really pay attention to, and this is an area that I think is really challenging for everybody, because if you think about, you know, when you think about an animal like a horse or really anything, a lot of times we think about it from kind of a profile view, because this is the most descriptive image of an animal most of the time. So where we kind of see it from the side. And it gets a little bit tricky when we try to draw something that's either coming toward us or going away from us, because it changes that shape that we have in our minds that really describes that animal. So what we want to do, we want to start out very basic again. We're going to draw this horse kind of running toward us. And though what we want to do is we have to think about the angle of the rib cage. So instead of it being a little bit more of an elongated rib cage, since it's coming toward us, it's really going to be a lot more round. And we don't see much of the spine, okay? Because foreshortening means that in a two-dimensional space, a lot of these lines get shortened, and that has to do with our perspective. And so we have to keep that in mind. And so then we have not much really of a spine back here, and then we have to kind of think about where this pelvis is going to be. And instead of the pelvis just being like this, the pelvis really, like the actual shape of a pelvis when something's coming toward us, is going to be a little bit more like this, okay? And we don't need to always draw that out entirely, but it can be helpful just to understand what is going on back there and how it's going to vary from how we typically do things. All right, so now we have our rib cage, we have our pelvis. The spine is kind of connecting these two, but it's very, very short. And now we're going to look at, first we're going to look at the legs, okay? So we have a leg, and again, just like with our action drawing, we're going to think about the angle of the leg. And since, again, this horse is coming toward us, we're not going to see all the different angles that we usually see from the side view. So instead of worrying about that, we're just going to kind of look at the leg and kind of just see where some of the joints are. But this is going to be more or less a pretty straight line. It's just coming at a very sharp angle. And then when we get up here, again, this is our rib cage coming toward us. And so we have two front legs, and they're going to be, one's going to be about here, the other is going to be about here. So this leg is a little bit more prominent, so let's go ahead and draw it first. It's really the same angle as this most prominent, most obvious back leg. And since it's coming toward us, you can see that this back leg is going to end back here, and this one's going to come up a little bit further. And then again, with our neck bone, we don't see much of it. We really see the skull right here. So you can see, you know, obviously why this is very tricky for people, because if I showed you this, you would probably never guess that this was a horse. And so it's very important to draw what you see and not get too caught up with what image you have in your head of that animal. So foreshortening is really going to be an exercise in drawing from observation rather than drawing from memory. All right, so this really is our basic structure right here. I'm going to go ahead and start adding some form around here, and it will start to make a lot more sense. You can see how important it still is to understand these basic structures so that things fit into place and things are proportional. And then you can see here too, the distance between this front leg and this back leg is very, very short. So again, that is essentially what foreshortening is. A lot of the lines that we're used to being very long get shortened because of our perspective. All right, now that we've got most of this form built in, and I think that you can start to see what's really going on here, let's go ahead and put in this back leg that's just not quite as prominent. So remember, here is our pelvis right here, and we have one leg coming out of this side, and this leg is going to be coming out of the other side. So let's just try to think about what it is doing back here. So we don't see a lot of it. So this is going to be basically it for that back leg. It's going to end right about there. But it's just all about understanding the structure, that basic structure, and how this all comes together. All right, so now that we've got kind of everything that we need, let's put this ankle up a little bit higher. So this is kind of the basic form of the horse. You can see that the head and the body are very close together. We really don't see much of the neck. We could kind of define this area a little bit more, just add a little bit more roundness right here if we want. But we're really not going into details here. And we can add a little bit of a mane just because that also helps give a sense of action. A little bit of a tail. But that's basically foreshortening. It is much more challenging, but I encourage you to practice it because you're just going to get better with it the more that you practice, okay? Try to think about that underlying structure and how it all works together, and try to draw the angles and the lengths of the lines that you actually see and not the ones that you kind of in your head think should be there for this to make sense. So when we started this out, it was very much unrecognizable, but as we added more of the form, we can see that this is clearly a horse and it's running toward us. So it gives a better sense of dimensionality to your art if you can start thinking about foreshortening and putting it into practice. All right, so let me show you how we're going to not only add markings to our tiger, but we're really going to refine this drawing. We're going to take it from, being very sketchy and having, a lot of these lines in here that we don't necessarily want to keep. We're going to turn this into really a finished drawing. And so we don't need to do anything more with this. This is here for us basically just to trace all of the good lines onto a clean sheet of paper. All right, so you can trace, or you can put this up against like a window with light coming through it to help you see the lines a little bit better. Otherwise, if you're having a hard time seeing your lines into your next sheet of paper, which if you're using printer paper, it's pretty transparent, but what you can do is you can always just go in and you can darken the lines with your pencil, or you could even use something like a Sharpie or some kind of dark marker, and that would really help you to better see the lines. I should be able to see pretty well, so I'm going to just kind of reposition this tiger so that it's more in the center of my page, and I want to keep it in place. I don't want it to slide around while I'm trying to do my tracing, so just get a little bit of tape here just to hold it in place. And now I'm going to go ahead and just kind of very lightly go around. And we don't need a solid contour line, especially with, this tiger, because a tiger is covered with fur anyway. So having like a really, really solid contour line around will actually take away from that sense of fur. So, keep it very light. Don't worry too much about anything, about having perfect lines or anything like that. We're just going to get this general outline here going. And for the markings, especially with something like a tiger, where it has a lot of stripes, we're going to find it very useful that we understand the underlying structure and then the form around that structure for this tiger, because that's going to actually play a big part in determining where the stripes are, how they fall across the body of the tiger. And if you see anything that needs to be corrected from your original drawing during this phase, don't be afraid to make some changes. Because after we've done all that work, you know, and we've got it, you know, basically in a very good, very strong position, but you might see some things that just need to be adjusted a little bit. We're just going to kind of estimate where this front paw is. It's kind of covered up with some leaves and stuff. And you can see I'm using my very loose overhand grip here still, because I want to keep these lines very light. I want to keep them very loose. All right, so we've got this basic structure going on here. You can kind of see where these eyes are. I know that that's one thing. Maybe I want to just adjust the eyes a little bit. So we'll go ahead and do that. I think that maybe I originally made the nose a little bit too narrow, so I can just very, very slightly make that a little bit wider. Tigers have a very wide nose. And then let's kind of just loosely place the mouth. And then we're just about done with our original sketch here. And then another thing that we might want to do, because there's a little bit of foreshortening here, because the tiger's head is turned toward us, we might just want to kind of define where, you know, they have a little bit of a mane here, not as much as a lion, of course, but we might just want to kind of loosely put that in, and that just kind of helps us to distinguish the head from the rest of the body. All right, so we've got our basic tiger here, so we can go ahead and put this away. I don't think I should need this tape anymore. And now what we want to do is we want to not just go in with the stripes right away, okay? What we want to do is we want to kind of put in some basic tone and shading, especially because you can see that there's some parts of the tiger that are white, like on the underbelly here, and there's a lot of areas on the face as well. So we want to kind of put in some tone where there's a little bit more of that dark orange. It's kind of a dark brown. And we might want to, you know, I'm not doing this in any special way, but I do kind of want to do some directional shading just so I can very clearly see maybe, you know, where the form of the leg is going to be. So anything that's kind of a darker orange, I want to go ahead and just apply a little bit of shading to it. And we're going to be building our stripes on top of that, and that's going to help them feel very much more natural than if we went in and tried to like outline every single stripe, or, you know, draw the stripes as solid lines, because they're really not. So we need to just be careful that we leave some areas lighter. And if you're not sure, you know, just go over it very lightly at first, and then we can refine to make it a little bit darker where we need to. Your shading doesn't need to be perfect. And you can see I'm still using my overhand grip, and I'm kind of using the side of my pencil to do this shading so I get some softer markings. Because even though we think about tiger stripes as being lines, they're really, really not. So what we're going to be doing is actually just using more pressure with our pencil. And you can see I kind of went out of the line here. Just ignore that for now. You can go back in later and erase it if you want to. All right, so around the face we need to be a little bit more careful with our shading, because there's some very important white markings, especially around the eyes. So let's go ahead and just very lightly mark in the white areas around the eyes so that we don't accidentally shade in there too much. I kind of like how these white markings, they kind of curve upward and they just wrap around. But keep the lines here very light so that they're not too prominent. And then there's some white around the mouth that we need to preserve, and some white just around the edges of the face as well. All right, so let's go ahead and just start shading in the orange parts of the face. And you'll notice we haven't done any of the stripes yet. We don't need to yet. We want to build up these values, and we want to treat them all very much like this, very soft, not too solid, because of course this is fur. And if we draw the stripes as though they are lines, we're going to lose that sense of fur. And I also just think that this is a much easier way to do markings than trying to go in and draw everything out individually. All right. And then over here, there's really not that much orange, but we will just, maybe some of these darker areas need to be darkened just a little bit more, just so that we have a little bit more contrast, maybe especially right here. And right here you can see I have a little bit too much contrast between the light area and the darker area, so I'm going to go in and just kind of lightly soften this all up. And again, I'm kind of going, you know, in different directions, kind of crossing things over. Ultimately though, you could do everything in one direction if you're comfortable doing that. That's not so important right now. It's not really what we are looking at. So what we're kind of looking at is giving that overall feeling of a finished drawing. And just like with the sketching phase, nothing needs to be perfect or a certain way. There's no right or wrong way. But what you want to do is build up your values, which is, you know, the lightness or the darkness of your markings. You want to build that all up very gradually. You don't want to go in, even though our eyes are kind of drawn toward the darker markings first, we just notice darker marks first. We don't want to go in and do all of those darker marks right away, because then we can make the mistake of kind of overshooting where those are and how dominant they are, when most of the animal is really kind of a medium kind of value, and then those darker markings are built on top. And then there's a lot of white in the tail, so all I'm really going to do in the tail is just kind of define the edge of the tail a little bit more, give it a little bit more form. Again, very loosely. And yeah, I changed the shape of the tail from the photo just to help it all fit in here a little bit more. And remember, the tail kind of goes up into the body a little bit. We have a little bit of foreshortening going on there. All right, so I think we're pretty close. This is kind of just the overall tone or value structure of the tiger. So we really have to kind of look past all the stripes at first. And you can see we've already got a much more realistic tiger going on here just from adding in a little bit of value. We can maybe add a little bit more here along the nose and the mouth. But try not to think of things as, you know, being lines. Like this area around the mouth, a lot of people want to, you know, they want to draw it like, they want to draw the mouth of a cat like this. But it really is all, it needs to be very soft. So go in with just the side of your pencil lead and make these areas, they're dark, yes, but they're not lines. Make them very soft, and they're going to be much more natural. And just notice, you know, the darkest part maybe is right here in this whole area where everything kind of meets up, and then here's the bottom of the jaw. Okay, so Just really try to get out of the habit, even though in here we do a lot of things with lines because we're simplifying things. But when we're trying to do a more finished drawing, a more complete drawing, we want to give things a little bit more of a natural look. And so there's really going to not be any lines. There's just going to be this buildup of soft values. Okay, so now what we're going to do, I'm going to start maybe from the tail. I'm not going to go through and just do all the stripes from here to the head all at once, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and just start kind of noticing the way that the markings match the form, like kind of follow the form of the animal. So here on the tail, because the tail is kind of rounded, the stripes are going to kind of wrap around. And it's not going to be super evident just because it's not a large area. It's going to be more evident actually here on the legs. So what I like to do is I just kind of like to go around the overall animal and just kind of map out how the markings match the form. So here on the rear legs, what I see is that they kind of wrap around here where the spine is, and then they follow the form of this leg, kind of the femur area. And we can even add a stripe right here because these stripes on this tiger really help to define that overall form. And so it's very useful. And so we don't have to get in every single stripe. All we need to do is kind of notice how the stripes fit around the form that we've already got here. And then when they get down here, they kind of start going a little bit more horizontal, and then they wrap around the leg over here, around this rounded form. And you can see I'm not going in and drawing, lines for these stripes. I'm still using the side of my pencil. I still have my overhand grip. I've even kind of given myself a little bit more space on the pencil. That kind of keeps my hand out of the drawing too. And a lot of people think that you have to go in and like blend the drawing, so that you get really smooth gradients. I would say that's, that's up to you. That's a personal preference. But for the purposes of this class, we're not going there. So we're going to allow everything to kind of blend together just by doing our shading. We're not going to get any like smooth blends or anything like that. When I was a kid, I used to use my fingers to smudge things, and learn later in life that, if you want your drawing to last a long time, you really shouldn't do that because the oils in your fingers are going to cause your drawing to yellow over time and kind of degrade over time. So, if you just go in with your value and you kind of just build it up, you really will find that you get a lot done that way without having to kind of overthink those kinds of things. And it looks, kind of nice and sketchy, which I really personally like. All right, so we kind of have our basic stripes going on there. And then what I'm noticing here along the middle is that there's not as much of a curvature. So these stripes are more or less going kind of straight down. Maybe this one's at an angle just a little bit where we have the form of the tiger shifting a little bit. But again, I'm not going in and drawing every single individual stripe. And then right here, I can kind of see these stripes are starting to wrap around a little bit more as we get closer to the front legs and the haunches. And by applying an overall general tone or shading to your animal and then placing the markings on top of that, it's just going to look much more natural, much more like actual fur, much softer. All right, and then these stripes get really interesting because they really wrap around and go into those front legs. And the stripes that are over parts of the tiger that are, shaded a little bit darker, they're just not going to be as prominent. And that's the way that it should be. Not every single stripe is going to be equally prominent and, noticeable. So some stripes are going to be more subtle. And then these stripes here kind of wrap around in that opposite direction. And you'll notice I haven't even done anything with the eyes at this point. I won't need to do a lot because this is, you know, kind of just a sketchy picture. We can do some, you know, close-ups of animal faces and kind of discuss how to approach that. But for a drawing like this, what I want to do is kind of create the overall sense rather than go in and, you know, have a really realistic eye and, you know, things like that. I'm probably going to reserve details like that for a drawing that's just of the face, so it's more like a portrait. You can see that not all the stripes, you know, start up at the top. Some stripes actually are starting down here at the bottom and not going all the way up. So that's another thing that you want to notice about markings. You know, they're not all going to be completely uniform. There's going to be a lot of variation in the markings themselves. And hopefully you're really starting to see how just being very loose with these stripes, kind of just roughly paying attention to them, but not trying to copy every single one, really helps give a nice realistic sense. And because we're using the side of our pencil instead of going in and drawing little tiny well-defined lines, it just looks a lot more natural. So we'll get these finished. These stripes on the tail are pretty simple. Again, we don't need to do every single one. And they certainly don't need to be perfect. All right, so that's good. So again, the area though that we're going to spend a little bit more time on and be a little bit more careful is in the face. So we have a nice prominent large stripe right here that kind of, it almost separates the orange parts of the face from the white mane that we have here, and kind of wraps around and goes all the way into the mouth area. And then another one right here. And what you're going to find too when you're doing this is that even markings that look very complex are pretty easy to sketch in, as long as, again, you're not trying to do the impossible. You know, you're not trying to go in and capture every single little detail. And then these stripes up here, there's actually kind of almost a sense of a stripe coming straight down here, and then when they meet, there's a little bit of a peak, and then they come down a little bit. And then they get more or less straight, and then they start to curve down a little bit, and they get smaller. And then maybe here in the ears, we'll just put in some darker marks where the ear kind of goes inward more. And anytime you start to feel your wrist or your hand get tired, just switch your grip up. So if you are doing a tripod grip and you start getting tired, just switch it up and just work overhand for a little while. It's really, really important to not wear out your hands and your wrists. Otherwise you end up having carpal tunnel syndrome and needing to wear a brace like I do sometimes. And you don't want that. You can draw your whole life without ever hurting your wrists. Just get yourself acclimated to using proper grips. All right, so you can see how far along we have come here. Let's maybe just add a few more of these last stripes here. All right, so what I can do now, I'll add just maybe a little bit more detail to the eyes because there are some very small markings around the eyes that give the tiger that tigery look. A lot of cats have this where they have some dark markings around their eyes, and it, I think, is one reason why we love cats so much, because their eyes really catch our attention and they're kind of intriguing. But again, kind of just treating this as some nice soft scribbles. And you can see, you know, I'm not going to go in there and draw like a pupil and an iris or anything like that, because sometimes, you know, the other thing I want to say is that sometimes more details does not equal better drawing. Sometimes adding too many details is actually going to make your drawing fall apart a little bit. All right, so we've pretty much got that. So again, I'm going to just use my eraser a little bit, even though I say don't erase, but you know, when you're actually doing a finished drawing and there's just some areas that need to get cleaned up, of course you can erase those. But when I say no eraser, I really just mean when you're sketching. And you need to sketch a lot. And when you're sketching, you need to just sketch. You don't need to, you know, spend time erasing, because erasing is not drawing practice. All right, so I think that looks actually pretty good. You know, we can, if we see some stripes in here that need a little bit more definition, some more, you know, kind of cross-hatching action, you know, this is the stage where you can kind of step away, walk away, come back, and really see if there's anything that really needs to be done, because, again, you don't want to do more than what you actually need done, because that's a very quick way to ruin a great drawing, is by kind of going overboard. All right, so there's our tiger. And I think that, you know, a tiger is an animal that has maybe one of the more difficult marking patterns on it that can be very intimidating. But I really hope that what you get from this is seeing that when we start from very general, so when I start with a very general overall tone, rather than going in right away and trying to do the stripes right away, it really makes the process a lot easier. It makes your drawing more realistic, more believable. And here even, you know, if we want to go in and kind of define some of the toes on the paws, again, not with lines, but kind of with some very nice loose scribbles, not making them too dominant or obvious. And that's how we get very natural looking drawings. And so I really hope that you can kind of see how simple this process can be, how we start out with just our basic knowledge of structure. I'm trying to find my structure page here. I've got more drawings here than I knew I was going to be doing. All right, so I hope that you can see how we went from this right here to this, and then finally to this. So really it's kind of a three-step process. It's all about understanding that underlying structure, learning how to observe and to create the form around that structure. And then from there to get to a more finished drawing, it's really just a process of breaking that down into the most general aspects of it. So the overall shading, the overall tone, and then if there's markings, building those markings on top. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed that. I think that the last thing that we'll do is kind of just look at maybe making a more detailed drawing of an animal's face. Okay, so let's do more of a portrait, and I think a good example is going to be this wolf here. And the reason for that is because there's some foreshortening going on, and so I think that that's something that we've always got to spend a little bit more time on that because it's a little bit tricky. But all right, so here we go. We're going to find the most basic structure, and we're going to build our form on top of that. We're just doing the head, so I don't have to start with a rib cage. I'm going to start with kind of just a circle. This represents the round part of the skull. And we know that with a wolf, it also has a snout coming out, but we're not going to get there yet. All right, so here we have kind of this general cranium, and we're going to do a line here to show us where the eyes are going to sit. And then the mid line of the face, and it kind of is going to, because this is a sphere, it's going to wrap around here. All right, so now let's go ahead and just very loosely mark in the eyes. All right, so now that we've got that going for us, and actually I think that they need to be much, much closer together. Again, no erasing though. So I'm gonna move this eye, make it just a little bit more dominant, just as a note to myself. And of course, when we make mistakes, we don't worry about them, we just fix them later. So now we can see that the nose kind of comes off. It's a little bit foreshortened, but we're gonna kind of find that midline of the nose. Just draw it down. It's going to extend a little bit past the kind of rough circular shape that we are letting that stand in for the skull. We're not going to go in and draw any wolf skulls today, although I definitely encourage it. Doing more studies like that is always better and going to help you become a better artist, but for the purposes of this class, we're just kind of learning the most basic ways to put together these drawings. All right, so let's kind of look at where the mouth is. Kind of just rough that in a little bit. And in order for this to make sense, we're not just going to do the head, so we're going to give it a little bit of context with the rest of the body. So we can see a little bit of body back there. And then we also have fur kind of extending out here a little ways, kind of getting this angle. And then up here we have the ears. And this won't be my, final drawing. I'm going to spend my time kind of roughing in the basic structure and form of the wolf. And then once we kind of have that in a good place, then we're going to transfer this onto another sheet of paper so that we can make it look a little bit more finished and nice. So this is all kind of the problem solving area where mistakes are going to happen and we're just going to correct them when they do. So then we have a little bit of fur kind of wrapping around here. The eyes kind of make him look like a little cartoon character, but again, not worried about details, so just let those be. And then let's give him just a little bit more context here. So just a little bit of the body kind of helps to make sense of the position of the head. And I'm just kind of adding in a little bit of the shading. We're not doing any details, but again, because there's so much fur and there's a lot of overlap between different planes of the fur, I want to kind of start thinking about all of that. Make this ear a little bit wider. And then the nose, the form of the nose kind of comes up. We're just going to scribble in all of that. Again, we're trying not to think about lines beyond what we did for the initial structure. Now we're starting to think of shading and value. So I want to notice too where there's some white here, because that will also help us to really make sense of what's going on with the fur. And for this final drawing, we will do a little more detail in the eye because this is more of a portrait. And so we're going to give our wolf a little bit more definition there to give him more personality. All right, so this is really good for my initial sketch and helps me to start thinking about some of the different complexities within the fur that will come up later. So as much of that problem solving as you can do early in the process, it's really going to help you in the long run so that you're not doing any guessing later in that stage. And then before I do the transfer, I do just want to make sure my eyes really are in the right position. I can see that there's a little bit of a marking here. And sometimes it's a good idea if you can just kind of take a step back from your drawing, look at it from a distance, because from a distance you might notice that things are, you know, something might be a little bit out of place. For the nose, we're going to keep it just a dark mark here. And then also for the mouth, let's make that a little bit more prominent. All right, so I think that you can see that that really, like, just little tiny things are going to make a big difference sometimes when you're drawing animals, and it's just a matter of building it up over time. So let's go ahead now that we have everything in place here. That's pretty hard to see actually, even for me. So I just want to go in and maybe darken a few things up. And also this kind of gets in front of the ear a little bit. Oh, and I just noticed too, we need a little more fur up here. We can soften up the transition between the white parts here and the darker parts. All right, let's see if I can get a good transfer here. I think what I might need to do is actually go hold this up against a window. And actually, instead of doing it this way, I'm gonna do my drawing this way, so it's in that portrait format. So that's another thing too. You can always change the position on the piece of paper. All right, so this is called a light box. It's a very handy thing to have eventually, but you can do the exact same thing with just holding your drawing up against a window where there's light coming in through the window. It's just going to help you to see. Oops. It'll help you to see better to do a trace. There we go. We go one more? Nope. All right. And I just want to get this overall shape going here. Placement of the eyes. Very light. So we're going to do some work within the eyes. We're going to keep the rest very kind of loose and soft. We'll do a little bit more detail in the eyes. And when you're doing a finished drawing and you want it to look, you know, nice and finished, you don't need to put an equal amount of detail everywhere within the drawing. There's some areas that you can leave a little bit more loose and sketchy, and then some areas that are a little bit more defined and finished, and that'll actually give your drawing a really nice look. So we're kind of going back to this not looking too much like a wolf. Again, the foreshortening makes it a challenge, I think, but we've already worked out a lot of those issues, so we know that our drawing will work. I think actually I want to, the eyes need to actually be a little bit higher up on the head. Just a little bit. Sometimes just that can make a huge difference. Very small changes can make a big difference, especially when it comes to faces, whether it's an animal face or a human face. Okay, I actually think that's good enough. We'll just keep our sketch up here because it'll be a good kind of roadmap for us. I'm just going to leave my light box up here, but I turned it off. Okay, so just like with the tiger, we're just going to go in and kind of put in a general overall tone, and we're going to build up off of that. I think what I'll do is kind of use just one direction for this whole initial overall tone instead of changing directions like I did with the tiger. And as I said, there's no right or wrong way to do that, but it's good to experiment. You know, one day you kind of do all your shading just using one direction. Sometimes you use cross-directional and just try different things. And what I want to do is just make sure, like, this area doesn't need to be totally white actually, but this area I do want to keep white. So that's where I want to be a little bit more careful. And you can see I'm not going in and doing like all the really, really dark markings. I'm keeping it very light now, and I'll just build the dark markings on top. Okay, so now let's kind of find that next darkest value to build. And even though I'm kind of losing where the eye is, I can kind of go in there and just indicate it a little bit more again so I don't completely lose it. Some darker marks by using more pressure here. But again, I'm trying to keep everything just for experimental purposes. I'm doing all my shading lines, my shading marks in one direction. Just to see what happens. A little harder to keep everything going in one direction when you're making these smaller, darker marks. And at some point, you know, when we go in and do more of the details in the eyes, then I'll kind of abandon doing this. But I kind of want to just build up these values with this one directional kind of shading mark. We're not going to have a lot of details in the ears. Alright, so let's go ahead and build up the nose a little bit, because right now everything kind of just looks like a big blob. Let's just gonna give some rough edges here too. Build up a little bit more dark down here. And then let's put some of the darker marks around the eye. We don't need to keep the eye, you know, white or anything like that, because the eye does have some color and some value to it. So no need to kind of avoid the eye area when you're doing your shading. Just, you know, don't go too dark over the eye, because we do want to have like some pupils in there so that you can tell what direction he is looking. So I'm just adding some dark markings around the eyeball. We'll define the mouth a little bit too, because that helps it kind of all feel like it's coming together a little bit. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a break from doing this directional shading, and let's do a little bit of work on the eyes to really define them. So we're going to go in with our shorter strokes, and we're just going to kind of define the roundness of the eye here. We don't see a lot of detail in the eye, but what we do see is the pupil kind of gives him some direction as to where he's looking. We'll also kind of add some more definition to the nose. And we can go in and really kind of define some of these markings right around the face that gives him a lot of character. But we don't need to go in and do every little detail in the fur, because really we want the focus maybe just to be on the eyes. And then here, we'll kind of just soften up this edge so it doesn't feel so much like a line. Okay, and then this area, I think we need to do some cross shading just to make it really, really dark so the face really stands out from the rest of the body. We'll kind of soften these ears up a little bit, make them feel nice and natural. Furry. All right, so I think that's actually a pretty good wolf portrait. And again, I hope that what you are seeing from these examples is that we start out very rough, very loose. We focus more on the structure, and all the details we're going to save until last. We're going to make sure that all of the structure is really, really good and natural and looks right. Then we're going to go into the detail, because you could spend a lot of time doing a drawing from detail to detail, and then you step away from it and you come back and you realize that structurally it's way, way off. So do your structure first, then do your form, then go in with details. And that is going to be the best way, not only to draw animals, but really to draw anything. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed this course, and watch it as many times as you need to, because I know I went through everything pretty fast, but I wanted to make sure we fit a lot of information into a very concise amount of time. So maybe just focus on one thing at a time and put those into practice before moving on to other aspects.